Let's work on that action button you find at the bottom of each box. Right now it's a regular button with the default styles assigned to it by the browser. I want to change that. And for that we could of course use the button selector, but we might have multiple buttons on the page and maybe we don't want to use the same style for all buttons necessarily. So what I'll do is I'll add a class, but I'll just call that class button. This allows me to still set up a generic button class or button style, which I can easily attach to any button I have. But if I ever have another button on the page, which I want to have a different style, I just don't need to attach it, and we don't have to worry about possibly getting into conflicts where we then need to override properties just because we want to go back to the defaults or anything like that. So I'll grab that button class assignment and add it to all the 3 buttons. And now with that, we can go back to the style sheet and work on the buttons. I'll add the button styles at the bottom of our plan section. And as I said, I will set up a generic button style for that button class. So let's use the button selector. And let's start by adding a background color. Here I want to use the dark green for all the buttons on the page. I also want to give them a white text like this. If we now save this and we go back and reload, we can see that, but we also see that the button has some strange differences. Let's inspect it in the developer tools. There we can see our button style is applied, of course. But if we scroll down, we see there are a couple of default styles set up, like a border, which is by default added, some default padding, and if we go down a bit further, we also see that there are a lot of other defaults when it comes to the text of the button. That's why the font here and the text in general doesn't really look like the text on the rest of our page. Maybe that's the style you want, but I don't want it here. It does, of course, inherit the font family from our body, but as you can see, this is actually overwritten because inheritance is always overwritten by direct style assignments. And the direct style assignment we're getting is the font assigned here, the font assigned by the browser. So this is something I want to change. And for that, what we can do is we can add the font property, and we could set the font family, but then we would keep the other overwritten font values. So I will target the overall font property, which is also just a shorthand for setting a couple of text properties in one step. And I will set it to inherit. Do you remember inherit? Inherit was a keyword, a value, which forces the inherited styles to be applied. So instead of using the browser defaults, it now will actually prioritize inheritance, though technically that's not what happens. It just looks at what it would have inherited and directly assigns these styles, so that we actually use the font family and the other font defaults we have on our page and we set up in our body. So with that, if we save this and we now reload, you see the button changed. It increased in size because the text size was also overwritten by the browser defaults. And now it looks more like the rest of our content, which I personally prefer. Now I also want to get rid of that border. So for that button, I'll also assign the border with the shorthand property. Set a 2 pixel or maybe a 1 pixel border here, or 1.5, maybe 1.5 pixels. Solid, and then also of that dark green. So we could also set it to none since you won't see it. The background has the same color. And I also want to override the default padding and set it to 8 pixels in all directions. Now finally, that's of course up to you, I want to add rounded corners. Of course, as always, feel free to pause the video and do it on your own. We can use border radius for that, and I will set it to 8 pixels too. Now if we save that and we reload the page, now the button looks more like the way I want it to look. One thing you'll notice though is that if you hover over it, you get no indication that it's a button. You don't get that hand cursor, and you also get no different hover style. So these are further things I want to add. I also want to change one thing about the text. I want to set the font weight to bold. But now for that cursor, I want to set the cursor, and you can set it with the cursor property, to pointer. The default is default. That's the normal cursor icon, but with pointer, you get that hand icon whenever your cursor is over the button, is hovering over the button. So now you see the cursor changes here. And the cursor property has more than default and pointer. You can, of course, as for all the properties, always see this on MDN or in your IDE if it supports that, auto-completion like mine does. Common values are default and pointer though. So with that, you can, of course, apply this to any element, not just buttons or links. You can add it to any element. You can indicate to the user that something is clickable. Now, the hover effect was another thing that was missing. So let's add a hover effect. Do you remember how that works? Yeah, you use the hover pseudo class, and let's also add the active pseudo class to change the style when we're holding the mouse pressed down. And there I want to set the background color to white and now the text color to the dark green. So I will reverse the styles. With that, if we reload and hover over the button, that looks much more clickable now. Now, one final thing I want to do, the button doesn't do anything right now. That will change over this course. But I don't like this blue outline we have here. So let's get rid of that in the next lecture, and let's also understand what an outline actually is.